today. My name is Vicky Cheng. I'm a managing director with Crowe. I've spent about 15 years here focused on IT risk management, implementation reviews, and cloud computing. Additionally, I'm the vice president of the Chicago ISACA chapter. This summer, Mike Grob and I co-authored a paper with COSO on applying the enterprise risk computing framework to cloud computing. And that's what we will focus on today. Mike, do you want to give a brief intro?
Absolutely. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Grob, and I'm with Crowe, as Vicky said, and based out of our Chicago location. And yeah, I am a partner here at Crowe in our cloud transformation practice. So I specialize in working with customers to help on their cloud migration journey, and obviously, governance is a big part of that. So looking forward to speaking with you guys today and having some conversation about things that we're seeing out there in the cloud governance space. So thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So here's our agenda, just so you know what we'll be talking through. We'll just go back to the basics to make sure we're using the same terms on cloud computing. Then we'll talk through the opportunities, the risks, and what the business impact has been of cloud computing and how that's really affected and changed architecture and how companies can achieve their business objectives. Then we'll go through the meat of the presentation, which is the COSO ERM framework and how to apply that to cloud computing, followed by how companies can achieve digital transformation, and then what we can do in terms of risk responses from both a compliance and an internal audit perspective. So with that, just some statistics. 94% of enterprises are using the cloud. So if anybody is not using the cloud in their company, firm, organization, could you just put that in the chat? That would be interesting to know what you guys are still doing. I'm assuming then that would make everything on-prem. But please, if you're not using anything in the cloud, please type that in the chat. And so because so many organizations are using the cloud right now, it's key to how organizations do business and manage their IT systems, applications, data, etc. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking through cloud computing and all the risks therein. So back to the basics of what's cloud. I think everybody on this call will probably know since you're all ISACA members, but really it's just on-demand computing. And usually it's shared resources so that you can provision and deprovision it more quickly. Now, most organizations are using a multi-cloud strategy that we've seen. So they may be using a bunch of software as a service, and those may be public cloud applications on the right. And then they may also have a private cloud for some, let's say, a data lake or something like that. And then they're using, let's say, Azure in one instance for their infrastructure as a service, and maybe Amazon for another platform as a service for the company to do their own development and things like that. And so they're using a lot of different providers with different cloud deployment models. What I really like about this diagram is that it starts to illustrate just who is responsible for what. And sometimes it's not just you, which when you have an on-premise solution, it's all you. And when you have, let's say, a platform as a service or an infrastructure as a service in the middle here, it'll be you and your cloud service provider. But depending on if it's infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, different items will be managed by different people. When it's platform as a service, you might be splitting some of that identity management aspect of things. And then if it's, infrastructure as a service, you may be managing the identity management application controls and not the cloud service provider. But then when we get over to the right, when you have a software as a service, and then that software as a service provider, your cloud vendor, it actually has their data and your application, everything hosted by another party. So let's say you're using something like a Salesforce or Workday, and they're using Azure, AWS to do hosting for them and manage certain processes like backups and things like that. Then that's when you get into the, not the third party, but now the fourth party. And you have multiple layers and multiple people responsible for different areas within the control environment. So I don't think we have polling enabled, but if you just want to put in the chat, which cloud hosting models you're using. I know usually most companies are using software as a service. Some are doing development and have different setups for infrastructure as a service or platform as a service as they're hosting their own applications and legacy developed systems. And then some other companies are using, you know, the function as a service, like desktop as a service or firewall as a service or something like that. And we do have some clients who are entirely in the cloud. They don't have any on-prem, they don't have any systems of their own, but they are using everything completely in the cloud. So just curious as to what everyone is using. So if you could just pop a note in the chat so that we understand where your organization and you are. And while we're waiting for people to do that, I think I'm supposed to pass it to you for opportunities, Mike.
All right, thank you, Vicky. So yeah, you know, as Vicky asked the question, you know, are you guys using the cloud? I mean, I anticipate everyone here is using the cloud in some capacity. No one responded that they're not. Perhaps if you weren't, you didn't want to say so. But I think one of the things to realize that a lot of people, a lot of folks that I work with kind of have a binary approach to the cloud. You know, are we in the cloud or are we not in the cloud? And I would encourage you to not really think of it that way, because there's all of those different, you know, complex cloud hosting models, as you know, Vicky had in that previous previous slide, and you're probably in the cloud in different, you know, different aspects in different areas, and it's going to continue to change. So you know, think about it more as what different cloud models do you have, and understanding kind of what comes with each of those models in terms of the responsibilities that you have versus perhaps the vendor has. But obviously with the COVID-19 pandemic that we're very much, you know, still in here, there's been a lot of rapid movement to the cloud. You know, organizations that had cloud roadmaps or strategies started to act on them quicker. Those that perhaps did not have a strategy, you know, rapidly came up with a strategy, or in some cases, you know, migrated things into the cloud without really having much of a strategy. So some of the reasons why we've seen that obviously is, you know, people working virtually. So the obvious examples with, you know, Zoom and Teams and virtual desktops. I think some of the other things that may be less obvious, you know, I had some clients where, if we're looking at the performance and security bucket here, where their business had a spike in volume during the pandemic, and they were able to kind of scale up their technology footprint by way of the cloud in a rapid way to accommodate that kind of unprecedented, unpredicted demand. And then kind of on the opposite front, I had another client where their technology footprint wasn't really in a state where they could easily leverage the cloud for that. So they had to kind of do it a different direction. But I think the point I'm trying to make here is that depending on the cloud model that you have, there is likely an opportunity to, scale up and scale down based on demand. And all of these, things here on the screen are relevant, and there's different triggers for why an organization moves into the cloud. But typically it's a combination of the things on here. Another thing to consider, innovation and digital transformation. So a lot of trends that we're seeing lately across all different industries and organization types is things with business intelligence and low code, no code development. The concept of kind of enabling a business user to build some sort of automation or workflows. Those things are made possible because of the cloud, and those are often entry points for different organizations, even if their systems that those tools are interacting with are not in the cloud yet. We can move to the next slide, please, Vicky. Yeah, in terms of risks, I mean, obviously there's a lot of noise and a lot of relevance to risk in the cloud, and you can't go a day without reading something about a security breach. And I think a very common misconception with some of these cloud models is that organizations have a belief or a misconception that they're outsourcing risk to someone else, or that because they're selecting a Microsoft or an Amazon or a Google, hey, they've got all that covered. It's all on them. It's just part of the platform. And I think I know from the survey results out there, there's a stat that something in the 99 percentile of breaches and incidents today happen because of folks misconfiguring the cloud platform. So one thing to consider is just, again, like, make sure you understand which of those cloud models you have and which of the IT responsibilities fall in your court. Often you can significantly reduce that risk, or potentially outsource or share that risk with one of the cloud providers if you, as the subscriber, configures the platform properly. So that step cannot be overlooked. Next slide, please. So, some of the other things, and I think I will highlight a couple here with kind of, again, just to bring it back to the pandemic in the last year or two here. So, hidden IT. So there may have been a rush to kind of work in a virtual environment, and a lot of these cloud tools can be spun up quickly. Perhaps they were spun up by end users or business users without IT backing and IT governance. So there's definitely, the cloud brings risks of if the business user, the end user, is not satisfied or doesn't feel that they have what they need, they can often go and spin up their own Dropbox or utility to share files, or take files elsewhere. So hidden IT is very common, and there are a lot of ways to combat that risk. There's tools that can detect all that and limit what you can do. So I would encourage you to think about that. Do you have a good grasp about whether or not there is hidden IT out there? And if so, do you have a way to kind of go after that and address it? Oftentimes what I see with clients is it's a matter of, speaking with that department or that person on the team and kind of understanding what they needed that they provision that certain tool for, and then kind of helping them move to a IT governed tool, or perhaps taking that tool under IT governance. But it's often not as big of a problem to actually resolve and fix once you have the conversation. So I would encourage you to do that. Another one, it's interesting, but the cost management, we had that as a benefit as well. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. So a lot of folks move to the cloud and they expect to get great cost savings, and then a lot of folks, spend more in the cloud than they thought they were going to spend. So I think having a really good understanding of the licensing model and the scaling model of your cloud platform. Again, going back to that chart before that Vicky shared, it changes based on the model that you're on. Infrastructure as a service has a totally different cost model than software as a service. And if you're running infrastructure as a service, it's great. You're taking that step to be in the cloud, but we're seeing a lot of folks that are kind of leaving cost savings and potential on the table by not taking a further step in modernizing and getting to platform or software as a service. So definitely make sure that you have a good understanding of the cost. Can go to the next slide, please, Vicky. So in terms of business operations and how cloud is changing things, I mean, from a person who works a lot with IT teams and change management, there's been a lot of movement in this DevOps paradigm, and it's really the having the technical development team and the IT operational team, and often the business users in the application SMEs kind of working together to having continuous integration and delivery. So your code deployments and your testing and all that, kind of the full transparency and collaboration through that process. A lot of new tooling is out there, and it's very important to have a good, well-defined software development lifecycle and DevOps process if you're using in the cloud. One of those reasons is because of the green box on here at the end. A lot of these cloud platforms, they're continuously pushing out updates. So you may be coming from an older model where you didn't take a lot of updates, but now you're in the cloud, the updates are happening all the time. So it's important you have a very robust and defined testing and SDLC process. It also can provide benefits to businesses and organizations because you're getting new functionality all the time. I mean, a lot of these software as a service providers are constantly coming out with new functionality, and those organizations that have a staff and a team and a mindset that are equipped to strategically leverage that new functionality, they're able to kind of do a lot now with new stuff coming out and kind of continually innovating and automating things with the cloud technology. One last one to hit on here, IoT. I mean, Internet of Things is we're seeing the impact in all different industries. You guys probably have Internet of Things in your house all the time with Nest thermostats and watches that detect fitness and things like that. But we're seeing it a lot in manufacturing in terms of getting that real-time connectivity to production and warehouse operations and reflecting that back to business applications and ultimately e-commerce and customers. And also IoT has enabled a lot of this virtual workforce as well, right? So a lot of kind of folks that would typically have to go in person to go and monitor and perhaps repair or fix things are able to kind of use some of the connectivity that's out there today with IoT to do that stuff virtually. So that's a big one. That's definitely here to stay. Vicky, I will pass it back over to you.
Thanks, Mike. And it looks like we have a question from Philip. Joy, I don't know if you're able to unmute Philip to ask his question.
Yep, I can do that.
Thank you. Okay, Philip, you should be unmuted. Oh, okay, Philip dropped his hand. Olivia also has her hand up. Olivia, I think you're unmuted now if you want to try to ask.
Sorry, that was an error.
Oh, okay. All right.
So apologies. I was saying that. I realized I was still on mute. Apologies.
Okay, that's okay. All right. Well, feel free, everyone, to ask a question, raise your hand, or you can pop it in the chat. So now we'll move over to the COSO ERM framework. So hopefully you're all familiar with COSO. They're the committee of sponsoring organizations of the Treadway Committee. They're made up of all those 5 organizations on the left, so mostly financial accounting types. But what they really do is they create different frameworks. Their 2 main ones are the Enterprise Risk Management Framework and the Internal Controls Framework. And these are sort of the de facto frameworks that everybody uses for Sarbanes-Oxley, if you need to be compliant with that. And then they also have different fraud and other governance frameworks. And so what we did over the summer was we published a paper with them to apply the Enterprise Risk Management Framework to cloud computing, to really think through how you want to think through cloud and the governance of cloud, and then how it also feeds back into the overall ERM process. So this is a picture of the COSO ERM framework, which is made up of 5 different components. And the first and the last, the governance and culture, as well as the information communication reporting components, make up these red and orange ribbons. And they're separated from the other 3 because they really permeate throughout the entire process, throughout ERM, as well as just generally the culture of the organization. Then in the other ribbon set, we have the strategy and objective setting, performance, and review and revision. And those are the meats of what happens in the ERM framework, as well as what happens when we think through risks and how to address risks and the risk management process. So then, how to apply that to cloud computing? Well, all of this is about risks. So as the organization goes through things, you'll want to think about what risks you have. And again, possible risks could be cybersecurity, data privacy, etc., and how you're going to manage those risks. As Mike was saying earlier, a lot of people think, oh, well, I put it on the cloud, I don't have to think about it, I have a SOC report coming in. But really, you can't transfer your risks. The risks are still yours. You can transfer the management and the ownership and the actual to-dos of the activities and who's responsible to perform something, but the risk is not something you can transfer. And so we want you to just remember that and think through what risks and mitigating responses you can have. So in governance and culture, really, this is about what the organization can do to just set up the framework. So you'll want to make sure the board is aware, you want to make sure management is thinking through things, and ideally creating a cloud steering committee. I think there is a statistic, over 60% of companies have some sort of cloud governance process in place. And that could include a steering committee, that could include, working with compliance and working with procurement and legal and things like that. You'll want to make sure that you have the right culture within the organization. Mike was talking earlier about hidden IT and shadow IT. And if you don't set up the right culture, then those types of activities happen more frequently. And that creates risk for the organization because you don't know what data is leaving the organization anymore and out there in the cloud. You'll want to make sure that people really understand the change management of all of this and how they're going to be involved, as well as how is their role changing if something that they were doing before is now managed by a cloud service provider. Then what is their new role? They're still part of the process and they're likely providing oversight to that cloud service provider, but what are they going to do? And do they have the appropriate training and understanding to do what they need to do? Moving on to strategy and objective setting, you really want to think through how your cloud strategy affects your overall business strategy, because what it should be doing is it should be supporting it. I was recently on a call with a technology company. They use the cloud. They also create products that will live in their own cloud for their customers. And they also create products where their cloud products are supported by, let's say, Microsoft Azure. And when I said, okay, so what is your cloud strategy? You want more people to be on your cloud so that they are completely in your ecosystem, but you already have clients that are in Azure and they selected you because they're able to use their existing Azure framework and then add your application and your system on top of that. So how are you thinking through what your overall strategy is for your sales and your growth? And so you want to make sure your cloud strategy supports that, not just on the external side when on the sales side, but then also how your cloud strategy supports the business on the internal side for what you're using to do to run the business itself. You want to make sure that everybody understands what the risk appetite is and things like that, and identify what your alternative strategies are to make sure that you are moving to the cloud in a way that makes sense for you. And Mike will talk a little bit more about different strategies to get on the cloud when he goes through the digital transformation section. Now, I like these two diagrams a lot. The left one is the COSO internal controls framework. That's generally referred to as the cube. And what we did was we added mini cubes inside the bigger cube. So you can think of your organization as this bigger cube. Now, each of these mini cubes you can think of as, let's say, one of them could be your cloud service provider. One of them could be another customer of your public cloud service provider. And another one could be the fourth party service provider to your cloud service provider. So all of these will now affect your internal controls because your cloud service provider is responsible for certain controls that you'll be managing that you'll need to monitor, but then what their customers and their vendors do could eventually affect you as well because you're in a multi-tenancy on this public cloud. And so you'll want to think through all of that. And similarly with the picture on the right, we have your organization in the middle, and then we have the different CSPs that you're using, and then their third parties, and then the customers and things like that. And you'll want to just realize that you're all connected and part of one ecosystem now because you're starting to intertwine what you're doing as you are all in the cloud together. So performance is the main part of the risk management process. You're identifying the risks, you're assessing the impact and likelihood of the risk, you're going to prioritize the risk, and then you're going to think through your different risk responses. In thinking through the risk responses, reduction and reducing is really the main one. Sharing in cloud computing, aside from buying some cybersecurity insurance and things like that, it's kind of difficult to share. It's also difficult to avoid unless you decide to either not go to the cloud, or let's say you try to you decide to go on a private cloud instead of a public cloud, but really in essence, you're not avoiding, you're just reducing. And so that's why reducing is the primary risk response in cloud computing, as long as you decide you're going there. But you'll want to think through all of the risks and how they impact you. And when Mike was talking about those different risks on that chart from ISACA from last year, they're still refreshing the one for this year. All the main risks that we think about for cybersecurity will also apply to cloud computing. So then we move into review and revision. And what this really is thinking through how you're going to manage the cloud vendors and manage the controls. And then how are you going to feed back information back into the ERM process to make sure that the ERM framework is getting updated and it's reflective of the current reality of what people are doing on the cloud. For instance, when the pandemic started and all these companies had to set up new infrastructure and potentially set up VPNs for their customer support teams who had generally been in the office at a call center, and are now working from home. They had to do all these things and expand their software and their infrastructure, but then that also then needs to feed back into the ERM process because they've increased their risk with the number of people who are now VPNing. They've increased their risk in terms of letting people work from home on a mobile device that is a bring your own device, right? And so that all needs to feed back into this overall ERM process so that it can be thought through holistically for the organization. Lastly, the information, communication, and reporting is really where we think through new things that could affect the organization. And how are you getting information to feed into that? So for instance, when you think through different vendors and things like that, and you're looking for something to help you assess your vendors, you might look at something like a security scorecard, or you could look at Navex Global or Dun & Bradstreet to just get a better understanding of what the vendor is doing. And you'll also want to look at different things like new compliance standards and things like that to use that to feed back into potential new risks that you will need to comply with and encounter in the future. And you want to make sure that you're updating the organization and the culture and everything on all of this. So what is key to all of this is really defining the roles and responsibilities. We talked earlier with the diagram on the bottom left, where we're splitting out the responsibilities between your organization, your cloud service provider, potentially your cloud service provider, so your fourth party, but what each organization is responsible for. All of those things should be defined in service level agreements in your contract. And then within your organization, you'll want to make sure that you're defining the roles within the organization. So what is the CFO doing? What is the Chief Information Officer doing versus the Chief Information Security Officer? What is procurement doing? What is legal responsible for? And defining all of these things so that you know who is responsible for what, and creating that RACI matrix so that you can make sure people can be held accountable to all of this so that you are managing your cloud risk. So this is to compare two different COSO frameworks. The one on the left is the ERM framework, which we've just been talking through. The one on the right is the internal control framework. Again, it's the cube. And the different purposes of each, you can think of the internal control framework as fitting into primarily the performance portion of the ERM framework. It's really about what controls are you going to design and test and make sure are operating effectively to manage your overall risk. But the overall risk is still reviewed as part of the holistic ERM process. So both of these are really just providing a framework for you to think through all of that. This, if anybody wants to answer in the chat, is just, can organizations transfer their cloud risk to a cloud service provider? We talked about this earlier. You can transfer the activities, but you cannot transfer the actual risk. That is still yours to own as an organization. So the answer here would be false. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Mike to talk through digital transformation. Mike, I think you might be muted.
Thank you. Thank you. I was talking to myself. Thank you, Vicky. Yeah, so digital transformation. So we spoke a bit about this earlier, but you know, some of the opportunities that we've seen with digital transformation in the cloud of late. A lot of the ability to move and, you know, rapidly go to the cloud and enable digital transformation kind of depends on the roadmap that you have and how quickly you can kind of adopt and iteratively weave in cloud technologies. If you want to move to the next slide, Vicky, I want to jump ahead because this is perfect because I covered some of the transformation earlier. So how does governance fit into, you know, digital transformation? So you know, cloud migration and cloud adoption typically has you know, phases where you do advisory and assessing, you know, build, migration, optimize. Those are kind of standard phases of doing a technology project to move into the cloud. Governance should really be embedded into all of that. You know, ideally governance is there at every step of the process. Now, in saying that, a lot of organizations didn't have the time to embed governance as much as they wanted to throughout this because they were in a hurry to move to the cloud, or perhaps they didn't have the skill set or the you know, financial backing to kind of slow down and look at the governance considerations. If you've already moved to the cloud or already there in some capacity, I mean, it's never too late to go back and put governance on. You know, I'm not suggesting that if you haven't moved to the cloud yet, or, you know, to not factor governance, but if you are there, I would say certainly take the time, go back, look at governance. We've worked with a lot of clients to do that retroactively, and yes, it's more difficult than doing it on the way, but it's not impossible, and it's not as hard as you may think, you know, to go back and retroactively implement it. So, you know, this slide is to depict kind of the ideal state of having governance in every process, and can, you know, especially as you're ongoing, you know, optimizing and tuning that cloud platform, right? If it's a you know, software as a service, you know, evergreen platform, it's going to continue to have new capabilities, and it's going to be important that you have governance around that. You can move to the next slide, please, Vicky. So these are this is a table that has some of the technical approaches to moving into the cloud. So I'll go through a couple of them to explain them. So the first one on the top, rehost. So rehost is often referred to as a lift and shift. It's basically kind of taking your servers and putting them onto cloud servers. So you're typically running what's called infrastructure as a service. So you are gaining some benefits about, you know, not having to manage anything physical, no physical infrastructure anymore. And it is often an approach that is quick. It doesn't have as much planning and orchestrating as the other ones, but you're also not necessarily getting the full value out of the cloud yet, because there's still a lot of responsibility on you as the cloud consumer. So it's sometimes used as kind of an entry point into the cloud. Sometimes it's, you know, skipped, but just wanted to call that one out. Re-platform. So re-platform is kind of where you're taking what you have on premise and putting it in the cloud and making some small changes to your technology footprint so you can start to leverage some of these new services that are native into the cloud. One example would be if you think of something like a database. So in your current model, perhaps on premise, you might have a server that has a operating system and then has a database in there. When you move to the cloud, you may have an opportunity to simplify it and basically subscribe to a database from a Microsoft or Amazon, and they handle the server, the virus scanning, the patching, the backup, and they just give you the database and you run your application on it. So that may be a way that you can start to get more of that benefit of the cloud without doing something drastic. Repurchase is kind of a common one where we're seeing for like ERP systems or just kind of legacy systems that are packaged software, where you would kind of move to a software as a service solution. So maybe you have an old green screen ERP, and as part of your cloud strategy or business transformation strategy, you decide to go with like a software as a service ERP, a NetSuite or a SAP or a Microsoft Dynamics, and you're kind of repurchasing and re-implementing something that's new in the cloud. And then refactor is typically for like something that is a homegrown, developed solution. Maybe the team has built something with Microsoft Access or some custom web portals, and there's an opportunity now to kind of develop that in a cloud-oriented way that has a lot of benefits to it. So those are kind of the four common ways of moving into the cloud. Got two case studies here, two kind of totally different organizations that we have worked with just to provide them a little more real world perspective. So this one was a large manufacturing organization where they have a lot of homegrown custom applications common in manufacturing. And they kind of had some key challenges or decision points as part of this project. It's, hey, are we going to do this internally? Are we going to pick a vendor to help us do some of these things? Are we going to be centralized from an IT governance perspective, or are we going to let our different departments and business units kind of dictate that? And the approach that they ended up doing was interesting, is they kind of did the best of both worlds. They developed some governance standards at the organizational level, but gave the business units the option of either building their own teams or having their own contractors to do the work to actually keep it at that governance level, or they could subscribe to a shared services kind of IT provider at the company-wide level. And they created a cloud center of excellence where they could kind of share the templates and security best practices for other folks to use. And it's a really cool model, because it at the end of the day, it mandated governance, but it didn't force these, because at this large of a company, there were some teams and departments that were much more capable of kind of doing things themselves, and they felt that they could do it quicker or better, themselves. And this kind of gave them that freedom, but also for those that couldn't do that, they had a pre approved vendor and contract there to kind of help and opt in at that shared services model. So this particular organization is leveraging the cloud quite a bit. They've got all different models, from infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. And it's interesting because they're using it strategically to actually reduce security risk. So this organization has global customers and vendors that they partner with, but there are countries where they don't do business at all, and they've been able to use the capabilities in the cloud technology to put very purposeful geographic based restrictions on who can access their different services and applications. So if they're not doing business in China at all, or somewhere, they've been able to configure these countries where there's no way that they can access the applications, and that helps reduce their overall security risk. It doesn't take care of everything, but it certainly reduces a lot of risk. And implementing that kind of control would have been more expensive and just more hard to actually roll out in the traditional on-premise model. So they've actually have applications that are still hosted on-premise that have an interest in that same kind of geo-based firewall blocking, and they're kind of ramping up their move into the cloud so that they can hop on to that new tool set. You can go to the next one, please, Vicky. So this one is a kind of a different organization in the sense of they're much smaller. They're a public sector organization. They've only got about 300 users. They don't necessarily have customers per se, given that that they're a public sector organization. But they were 100% on premise, and they were doing kind of just an IT roadmap about opportunities to reduce risk, with everyone being concerned about security, and to provide a better user experience for their 300 user base. And there was a lot of low hanging fruit that was found and surfaced by basically moving into the cloud and doing that first model that I spoke of, that kind of a lift and shift model. This organization was able to get quite a lot of value out of just taking that first step and doing a bit of minor refactoring as well. And the cool thing that they did here is they took the opportunity to not only look at their IT technology roadmap, but kind of look at how they wanted to reshape the philosophy of their internal IT department as well. And there were some folks kind of nearing the end of their career who were going to be moving on, and they had plans to hire new folks, and they strategically lined it up so that they could hire folks that were interested in kind of learning this new tool set and be a part of the cloud migration project. And they also selected a vendor that was willing to take more of a collaborative and hands-on approach to the project versus kind of doing it in the background. So the vendor worked with the new IT team as part of this migration process to help provide on-the-fly training. I thought it was just a really cool mentality to kind of show the overall investment in their internal teams, and they to be to have them be a part of that whole process. So the polling question here, if you want to comment on the chat, is true or false? Should cloud governance be embedded into the implementation process? I'm sorry, cloud governance should be embedded into the implementation process, but it can be incorporated into an existing cloud environment. True or false? And the answer is true. Yes, it should be embedded. But if it wasn't embedded, you should still go back and retroactively implement and document your governance strategy. Vicky, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Mike. So we just have some practical risk responses here. The main one is really to use the COSO internal control framework and think through different types of controls, whether they're general governance controls, their management, their technical controls, whether they're IT general controls or their application controls or whatever. We really want you to think through the controls that you can apply at an entity level, at an operating, and at a function level. So make sure that you're not just relying on IT to manage all of these controls, because you'll want to use the business to manage certain controls. Oftentimes, the business is really in charge of the relationship with us for software as a service vendors. You can utilize your procurement department to help you with some of those vendor management controls to make sure that you are getting everything you need to out of your service level agreements from your cloud service provider, and they're meeting those, or if they're not, that you're getting that rebate if you didn't get the uptime or you didn't get the response rate, et cetera, that you were supposed to get. But you really just want to make sure that you have all the controls implemented. And so some specific things that we can do is, let's say for reliability and vulnerability management, you'll want to make sure that you have performance monitoring processes in place. And so in some cases, if it's infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, there may be things that your vendor is doing, but are they also sending you an email? Or are they giving you access to a site where you can manage and review the uptime and things like that? And then what are you doing if you have access to that? What controls do you have in place to make sure that somebody is monitoring that? So once you establish your controls to make sure that that's being monitored, then what can internal audit or compliance do to make sure that those controls are then being followed? Could you do a what type of audit would you do on that? And same with incident response plans. So with everything, you want to make sure that you have an incident response plan in place, and then you'll want to try to do some different exercises to make sure that things are being escalated to your vendors as appropriate, and that your vendors are escalating items to you as necessary as they manage different issues. For compliance, you'll want to make sure that you have different monitoring processes in place so you can identify new compliance standards that will need to be addressed by your organization, and then making sure that you have a process to go through and review your cloud service providers to make sure that you can then still comply with that new standard, especially with all the new privacy regulations that are coming out. For each state seemingly has their own variation. You'll need to just review those and make sure that your current technology environment will be able to address those compliance standards. And so I know we're getting close to time, so I want to give Joy any time needed to wrap up, so you guys can talk about any next sessions or anything else, but we really appreciate the time we've had to spend with you.